it's not criticism of the OBR, but a criticism of the process has been that the OBR just simply has to take. If the government says, I'm going to spend X next year, then the OBR has to believe that that's what the government is intending to do, even however difficult that looks. So it's, the current chair of the OBR used a remarkable phrase before the last election when he referred to the spending plans as not even fiction, because at least somebody has bothered to write down fiction, which I think was even stronger than I managed to say as head of the independent IFS. Although we made very clear that the fiscal plans didn't look terribly plausible, because essentially what happened before the last election is the last government said we will increase public service spending by 1% a year each year for the next 5 years, without saying how they would do that. And of course, if you do that and do anything vaguely plausible on things like health and defence and so on, that's big cuts across everything else, but without actually telling us how they were going to do it. Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and this week we're going to be talking about the Office for Budget Responsibility. It's very much in the news at the moment, very much in the mind of the Chancellor, as it comes up with its forecast ahead of the spring forecast. It's not a spring budget. It's not even, I think, in the Chancellor's words, a spring statement. It's just going to be the presentation of the OBR's forecasts. And those forecasts, of course, underpin chancellorial decisions, and they also tell us whether and to what extent the Chancellor is meeting her fiscal targets. And one of the concerns at the moment is that the OBR may well be telling the Chancellor that she's not meeting her targets, and that will require some action. To look at that, to understand the role of the OBR, and to talk a bit about how that works within the Treasury, I'm joined today by Andy King and Gerard Lyons. Now, Andy has previously worked at the OBR and was a member of the Budget Responsibility Committee. He's now senior partner at Flint Global. Gerard has spent over 30 years in senior roles in the city and public policy. He's currently Chief Economic Strategist at Netwealth, a senior fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and most importantly, produces a rival podcast with his comedian daughter, Elphonomics. I'm not sure you're going to get too many laughs with this particular podcast. So let's start with the question of what this mysterious beast, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, is and what it does. And who better to tell us that than Andy King, who worked there for a considerable period of time and was indeed a member of the Budget Responsibility Committee. So, Andy, what is this thing? And in brief, what does it do?
So the OBR was set up to try and take the politics out of the analysis around fiscal forecasts, economic forecasts, fiscal analysis. And while it does many things through the year, perhaps its most important job is to produce the forecasts that form the basis of the Chancellor's budget each year. It does that in a slightly unusual process for fiscal councils in that it is tightly integrated into the budget process. It sends draft forecasts to the Chancellor with a well-written note that explains whether the fiscal targets are on course to be met or not met, and it scrutinises the government's proposed policy decisions before they're announced in the budget to understand how they will affect the public finances. So, in a sense, it's there as a kind of dry, analytical, objective, unbiased body to raise the profile of good analysis in the whole budget process, to avoid what my first boss described as politically motivated wishful thinking, the belief that your policy is going to change the world, create lots of revenue, allow you to spend, and then further down the line you find it wasn't true and you're in a fiscal problem. So that's his main role.
And of course, it was set up all the way back in 2010 by George Osborne. A part of the reason for that was a sense, at least, that the previous Labour government, particularly under Gordon Brown, had been guilty of that politically motivated wishful thinking in terms of the macroeconomic and fiscal forecasts that they were making. So the idea is that the OBR may be wrong, but at least it's honestly wrong and independently wrong about its forecast. And that's not a criticism. All forecasts are wrong, but the OBR is at least objective and independent. Gerard, as an outside advisor, as an outside commentator, is your sense that the OBR has achieved what it was set up to achieve, which I think we can broadly take as creating more transparency and honesty in fiscal policy?
Yes, I would say it has. I'm very positive about the OBR. Indeed, if we go back to when it was introduced in 2010, there was a significant contrast to the introduction of the OBR then and, say, the Bank of England in 1997. Now, because the bank had done so well, I would say, in those first 13 years, when the OBR was created, it landed pretty well, pretty quickly. There was no real debate about it, despite the fact that initially its economic forecast was sort of quite wide of the mark. But then that was the case at 2011, 12, 13, when the European Union went into a deep downturn, and that had an impact on us. But I think over the years, the OBR has really matured very well. I think when one looks at it, it's landed well both domestically and overseas. 5 years ago, I would say the OBR assessment was carried out, or the external assessment of the OBR was carried out by the OECD. And then I would say that they viewed the OBR almost as a sort of leading fiscal institution in terms of providing independent analysis.
And that's despite some criticism from particularly some of the Brexiteers, particularly some on the right, of, I think, criticised the OBR for being too negative, for not taking account of the positive potential effect from supply-side reform and those sorts of things. So it's worth saying that if you actually look at the OBR forecast, if anything, they are over-optimistic on average, despite how gloomy they sometimes appear.
Yeah, I would say there's two different parts to that. One is the dynamic scoring, where the OBR takes announced but yet to be delivered policies and decides how to assess them. And we can probably come on to that because that was a key part of this latest external review. But the second part is the question about the independence of institutions. Now, independent institutions, I think, have held up very well. But this debate really goes back to the early 60s when, under Harold Wilson, the debate was whether the Treasury should be split up. And that debate has continued, indeed, came to the fore with Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor and also when he was Prime Minister, about whether the Treasury should be split up into different functions because it basically handles economic and fiscal and budgetary roles, which in other countries are separated. Questions and criticisms of independent institutions are often questions about their credibility and competence, and shouldn't be always seen as questions about their integrity or their independence. But there's no doubt that in 2022, the OBR got caught up in all that. But when it comes to the dynamic scoring, the question is whether the OBR should actually be more upbeat. So the OBR has recently started to, I think, be more proactive about how it assesses policies. That's so important, as the OBR is now so embedded in the process, is given extra weight, extra credibility. So how it actually gives the thumbs up or thumbs down to policy, I think, is the critical issue.
Well, let's come back to that. I mean, they sound like a reasonable set of tests, the ones that you've outlined there. But before we get into the detail of that, Andy, I think it'd be really helpful if you were to set out for us and for listeners exactly how this process works. As you come towards a fiscal event, as you come towards a budget, how does the interaction between the OBR and the Treasury work? What are the steps along the way? I mean, as open as you can be from your experience of how this has actually worked in practice.
Yes, so there's a formal process, if you like, toing and froing of information. So the OBR provides 3 formal updates on how the fiscal targets are performing in the forecast as it evolves.
Have you got 3 different ones because more economic information is coming in over the period, or because of policy changes in the Treasury, or both?
First, there's 3 rounds of forecast that we call pre-measures before taking into account the new budget policies. There's 3 rounds, partly because it's so complicated and partly because new information is coming. So in the first round of the forecast, the OBR tries to take the big decisions. So what's our medium-term productivity growth rate that determines revenue over the 5-year forecast? And then From there, we then look at the next layer down of detail. So what are all the different types of income that drive different tax bases? What are the nature of the labour market and how it interacts with the tax and welfare system? And then there's a final round of kind of just polishing off any wrinkles. The forecast is very heavily a judgment-based forecast that's compiled in a big model. There's a lot of talk about the OBR's model and whether the model is right. The model is a huge calculator. What goes into the model is the judgments of the committee members and the staff that are working for them to help them through all of those decisions. So you can't finish everything within the first round. There will be things that are evolving, issues that come up that the committee asks the staff to go away and look at, like is the mortgage market doing something unusual? Then once we get to the third round, then there's a process of factoring in policy, which is partly to do with what it does to the economy, mostly is what it does to the public finances and the individual lines. That formal process is surrounded by, a very large staff level engagement with civil servants in different departments. At more senior levels, there will be discussions about, where is the Chancellor looking to land this budget so that the OBR can always be informing about the right bit of the forecast, flagging the right bit of the forecast. The way I used to think of it when I was Chief of Staff and running this show was, from OBR side anyway, was we're there to inform, not to surprise. So it's fine for the OBR to turn up with terrible news for the Chancellor, as long as I, as Chief of Staff, have prepared the ground properly, made sure that the various teams in the Treasury know that there's bad news coming because I know we're about to revise down our productivity forecast. The times that it doesn't work as well is when, we realize we've missed something. And so we need to change something in the forecast and we throw it in overnight and we say, by the way, you've just lost X billion pounds. It's a huge pyramid of models and spreadsheets and things that add up to the thing that gets published on the day. And so there is always a chance of human error or model error coming in. And while the quality assurance is going, someone's going to find that terrible moment where you've put a plus in as a minus or something. But most of the time it works very smoothly. Most of the fiscal modeling, the kind of turning the handle on models, is actually outsourced. So it sits within particularly HMRC and DWP. Often their models will use confidential data. The OBR doesn't get to see the model working. They get to see what goes in and they get to scrutinize what comes out. But that iterative process is what makes for a budget. And the reason why it's particularly useful to have that is that analyzing the data is when you find out whether your policy is working, whether whether some development in the economy is it going to last or is it a one-off? All of those questions inform the forecasting, but the OBR's work actually feeds into then what Treasury officials will be informing the Chancellor and so on.
One of the issues in recent years has been whether the government has been gaming the OBR, so to speak. And I think this has come a lot to the fore, particularly with this latest review, that because the information sharing, the government will naturally only give good news to the OBR. And if there's bad news, they'll try and keep it hidden, like on the public spending ahead of the recent election. That was one side. And then the other concern people in the city particularly have, and I think this may come through on the policy side, is whether it now works in the back to front way, because the OBR is so central in terms of their scoring, whether, for instance, a policy is trailed with the OBR behind closed doors to see how it will impact things. And then the Chancellor decides whether to proceed or not. For instance, it was well known at the time, or the Institute for Government brought this to the attention, that when Jeremy Hunt was Chancellor, the question was whether income tax should be cut or whether national insurance should be cut. And they trailed both of these with the OBR. And because the OBR thought that national insurance cuts would increase the labour supply more, there would be more of a positive impact on growth, that forced the Chancellor to go that way. Now, I think as an economist, it's really good if the OBR being there forces sensible longer-term economic thinking. But there is a concern that sometimes there's this gaming behind the scenes, and this trailing of policies means that the OBR is driving the policy agenda.
So I guess there's it depends how you see that. If you think that the OBR is a good economic institution, and the Chancellor is saying, well, which one's better for the economy, national insurance or income tax, and it comes up with an answer, that's not necessarily what I'd call gaming.
The gaming was about, I think this external review highlighted that in particular, that the government would give as much information as possible about policies that they were favourable to, and policies where the government was sort of keener for it to be kept sort of below the lid, they would not give the OBR so much information. So forcing the government to be open and transparent, I think, is what we all want. And I completely agree with you. If the OBR itself starts to force sensible longer-term economic decision-making, such as let's boost investment to address infrastructure spending, then I think that in itself is a good thing. So if it forces an open, transparent, and in the long run, positive economic policy outcome, then that has to be welcomed.
As I understand it, and correct me if you have any other information, when Rachel Reeves came in and started talking quite a lot about this £22 billion black hole, at least some of that, it seems, arose from the OBR, and then the OBR reported on its view about this in the autumn budget. And my impression is that they felt that they weren't given all the information they ought to have been by Treasury officials before the last election. Is that your understanding of what happened?
I think it was a very unfortunate kind of confluence of circumstances whereby the OBR process, and this is one that I very much bear some responsibility for, of looking at departmental spending, focused very, very strongly on the year in progress, the year for which we have, depending on when the forecast is, 6 months or 9 months of the year gone and data available, and departments' forecasts available. We used to look at it in all the angles we could think of, like how much cash are they asking the Treasury for? What have they told a different part of the Treasury about their expectations? What does history tell us about the fact that departments always underspend by a bit so that their accounting officer isn't hauled in front of Parliament? What we did less was say, what's the implications of what's happening this year for next year? Next year, if next year was within a spending review, we'd kind of take the spending review totals as given. And so it was that next year that was the year where the 22 billion black hole emerged. So I was looking at this in my OBR role until a year and a half ago. There's one part of me that wasn't surprised at all that it was 22 billion or that it was near 20 billion, because if you looked at what inflation and wages had done since the plans were set, 20 to 30 billion was the number you came to, and that was in an OBR report 2 years ago. But at the same time, when the Treasury's kind of blow-by-blow account of where the 22 billion black hole came from and the use of the reserve asylum and the other things that were in there, you could see why the OBR felt like the Treasury should have volunteered that. And you can also see why the Treasury might think, well, you didn't ask. You didn't ask the right question. We didn't conceal anything that you wanted. Maybe we concealed something that you needed. Now, the other part of this is that forecast that had a 22 billion black hole in was Jeremy Hunt's as Chancellor. If the Conservatives had won the election and he'd said, right, I'm sticking to my spending totals, the Treasury would have told him, here's your options.
Yeah.
No pay rises, this, that, and the other. So was the Treasury wrong to say that this is Jeremy Hunt's plan for spending in 2024-25, and now we've got a new government, and here's how much you would have to cut to achieve that? The kind of the decision tree has been broken in different ways because of the election result, because of the way departmental spending works. Stepping right back, the way the OBR used to forecast departmental spending was simply to forecast the Treasury's ability to stick within totals. It's a forecast of public spending control. It's not a forecast of how much it costs to run the health service. Now, I think they're trying to basically do a bit of both in the future so that you can't come to this moment where there's a huge black hole that, means the starting point for a new government is kind of almost untenable.
I mean, it's not criticism of the OBR, but a criticism of the process has been that the OBR just simply has to take. If the government says, I'm going to spend X next year, then the OBR has to believe that that's what the government is intending to do, even however difficult that looks. So it's, the current chair of the OBR used a remarkable phrase before the last election when he referred to the spending plans as not even fiction, because at least somebody has bothered to write down fiction, which I think was even stronger than I managed to say as head of the independent IFS. Although we made very clear that the fiscal plans didn't look terribly plausible, because essentially what happened before the last election is the last government said we will increase public service spending by 1% a year each year for the next 5 years, without saying how they would do that. And of course, if you do that and do anything vaguely plausible on things like health and defence and so on, that's big cuts across everything else, but without actually telling us how they were going to do it. Can I come back, Andy, to what you were saying a couple of minutes ago about the process? I think there were three things that were very striking about the process by which one gets to the sort of fiscal numbers. One was just the complexity of it, and this is something I try to get across every time I'm asked, is there going to be headroom? Where how much space is there going to be against fiscal targets? And the answer is, given happening right now, it looks like they might have run out of space, but there are so many moving parts, you can never be sure, because there's so many things that you're trying to forecast in this. Second thing that was very striking, what you said, is there isn't really a big macroeconomic model in the way that the Bank of England has a big macroeconomic model. This isn't sort of just feeding stuff in. It's not an entirely objective process. You really focus on the importance of judgment here. That must put a lot of pressure on the people making the judgments, particularly in this very politically febrile world. And the third thing is the really remarkable reliance you have on analysts in other government departments, which I think people don't necessarily understand, because the OBR is quite small, 50 people, something like that. So it's not, given the things that it has to do, which is essentially forecast for actually every tax and every bit of spending and the fiscal situation, the macroeconomic situation, and all those things, that's not a very large number of people. How much pressure do you feel in the OBR, knowing that the judgments you make could determine the political future of the Chancellor? You must feel under pressure there, and I imagine that the current OBR people must be feeling, they know that if they come to Rachel Reeves for this spring forecast and they've got a big fiscal hole, and that's a result of their judgment, which they're not certain about in terms of productivity and things, that must be quite a responsibility. It is the Office of Budget Responsibility, after all. But
It is. So I should just correct, there is a huge macroeconomic model. It's just that it's a very, very, very big calculator in large part. It makes sure that everything is consistent.
Yeah.
The most important judgment is medium-term productivity growth.
Yeah.
And that is something that the OBR thinks about outside of the model.
Yeah, so there isn't a model that tells you what's going to happen to productivity. That's something that you have to, and as you say, that's the most important input into it. And I suppose the responsibility is, the OBR is more optimistic, for example, than the Bank of England on that. If they shift their judgment towards where the bank is, that's going to have a big headache for Rachel Reeves, and therefore a huge responsibility on the OBR.
It is. And so I think when Charlie Bean was the economic lead at the OBR, he had been deputy governor of the Bank of England for a very long time. The Bank of England is obviously much better known and much more followed than the OBR as an institution. And he said, look, the most consequential decision I've made in my public life is at the OBR, where I decide, ultimately I decide what medium-term productivity growth is, and therefore what the tax revenue forecast is over the medium term. And yes, we take that incredibly seriously. And there's an awful lot of analysis goes into trying to understand why productivity growth has slowed down since the financial crisis and whether and by how much it will recover in the future. And the problem is there is no good, the trite answer is that we don't really understand how productivity works in the past. So how are we going to forecast it in the future? And so the OBR relies on everyone else's analysis, its own analysis. It looks at, averages. It looks at theories. It looks at applied answers. The thing that the OBR will do, and that, I used to do in the past, is think about when it's going to do a big review of productivity. And if it's going to change it significantly, then there will be a kind of run up to that. Now, I'm quite sure that the OBR right now will be thinking, look, this is our second forecast for the Chancellor. We gave her her first forecast and she set her plans for the Parliament. There's a high bar to coming back and going, well, a few months have gone and productivity's weak again. So I give up. Let's revise down. Here's another £30 billion fiscal hole to fill. But at the same time, as you say, they are already nearer the top of the pack than they have typically been in the past. And that means that the kind of productivity disappointment that you saw driving the Bank of England's forecast revisions last week, it's very difficult to do nothing in response to that. And it's very difficult to say, oh, look, it's weak now, therefore there's scope for stronger growth in the future if you're starting nearer the top of the range of forecasts. So that, that will be a very, very difficult set of meetings about, look, how much do we think the weakness of productivity is just that there's problems in the data? We know there's problems all over ONS data at the moment. Can we basically ignore it and say, look, this will be revised away in the future, so we're not going to make a, precipitate decision about the future? Or do they go somewhere in between where, all right, look, it's weak now. It's obviously going to be weak in the year coming. Let's just take a little bit off the near term, leave our relatively optimistic growth rate in the medium term. If they do something like that, it still reduces the cumulative growth in the size of the economy, cumulative growth in revenue, and that still leaves at least a fiscal problem. And then, it depends on how far they've revised and what happens to interest rates over the next couple of weeks. And of course, those hundreds of other things that people don't see so much of. When we started reviewing fiscal forecast models, the first thing we did was count them. And there were more than 300 models being operated for us around government.
These are models of individual taxes.
Models of individual taxes, individual bits of public spending, the local government finance system, which the IFS is probably one of the few institutions that understands. There are dozens of models because there's all sorts of different things that go on in there that affect the finances. So any of those can throw up, 100 million here, 100 million there. Some of them, a billion here, a billion there. Some parts of the public sector that are quite arm's length from government. So Transport for London can update its business case. That affects the public finances, has to go in the forecast. Sorry, Chancellor, it arrived on Thursday. We've had to revise up or down by X.
Some of the most important judgments that I think anyone in politics, these are very powerful people who I think would probably prefer not to be quite so powerful in the sense of the judgments that they have to make. I was very struck by the forecast in October, which had changed hardly at all since the March budget last year, which, given the change in the change in government, you can see why. I'm not saying that there was anything, any shenanigans here, but you can see why it would have felt uncomfortable to have given the new government a big up or down in terms of the forecast going forward. How does it look from your point of view, Gerard? How much credibility do the city put on the OBR forecast as opposed to anybody else's?
Well, the OBR's forecasting record is relatively good. It stands up very well. The important thing is, based on what Andy was saying, is that the margin of error on these fiscal as well as these economic forecasts is significant. Like the OBR's margin of error on the economic growth forecast, according to the OBR itself, is 0.5% in terms of growth 1 year ahead. The press often takes their forecast as if though they're guaranteed to turn out to be the case, but they aren't. But they actually stand up really well compared to elsewhere. When it comes to the fiscal numbers, when the government itself is spending £1.3 trillion a year, the margin of error means that it's easy to get 20 or 30 billion out here or there. Again, headline-grabbing news for a sort of daily newspaper. But in terms of the city, the OBR's forecasts stand up very well relative to the competition. They set a good benchmark, and they, in some respects, one person city told me they regard the OBR as their cut and paste. They cut and they paste their forecast. And I can understand why this economist, who probably wants to be nameless, said that to me, because the OBR has actually established its credibility. One thing we haven't talked about is the leadership. And I think the leadership of the OBR has been very good over the last 15 years. And I think that, alongside the actual numbers that they produce, has put them in a very good position.
You have to be unimpeachable integrity and have the real trust of everyone concerned to maintain that independence.
Yes, and confident that what you're putting together is your best guess and best assessment, and it's the honest take on where we are. Clearly, when you have a very difficult economic backdrop, as we do now, and given that the OBR is starting to become more proactive in terms of dynamic scoring, in terms of policies, that means they have to be very robust in what they put forward, because it will have a big impact. The underlying picture is one where the debt level is very high, the growth picture is poor. The UK economy is a low growth, low productivity, low wage economy. So the OBR, in terms of projecting its productivity forecast, sort of it is somewhere halfway between where we are now and where we were before 2008 in terms of the productivity growth. But it probably comes more to the fore when they do their 2-yearly 50-year projection. Their base case has debt to GDP going to 274% of GDP in 50 years' time. Now, UK has had debt to GDP up as high as 250% in the past, but albeit after wars, after the Napoleonic War and after the Second World War, and then it came down. But the OBR's central projection is that unless action is taken, the debt to GDP level will keep going up. But in that same analysis, they have a high growth projection based on 2.5% productivity growth. The importance of the productivity is central not only to the near term, but also to the longer term projections.
Yeah, and people may not be aware that whilst the core role of the OBR is it's each fiscal event, it's making forecasts over the next 5 years. Every couple of years, it also does these long-term pieces of work, which are quite scary reading. I mean, they basically say if we grow as we expect to grow over the next 40 or 50 years, we are going to have some pretty big choices. I mean, really big choices over tax and spend to avoid debt going ever upwards. We probably need a separate conversation to focus on that particular issue. But I think it's a very important thing to put into the public domain, and something that politicians do not want to talk about, because that means taking these tough decisions over what we're doing on health spending, what we're doing on pension spending, how much tax we're rising.
Well, when you look at the fiscal numbers in the UK, they're terrible. But
you're rather cheery.
Yeah. But if you're looking for a positive, is that we're not alone in this.
On the upside, everyone else is in trouble too.
6 of the 7 G7 countries, Germany the exception, has incredibly high public debt. But the IMF last year pointed out that globally, both public and private sector debt were not far off their all-time highs. Now, if you want to be sort of cut straight to the chase, so to speak, in the UK, when you have high debt levels, then you have really 5 options: grow, reform, austerity, tax, or borrow. Now, ideally, you want strong economic growth, but that means productivity growth being much higher, but we don't have that. Ideally, you want to reform the public sector. You don't have that at the moment. It might come in time.
Hard to do.
So then you look at the other 3 options, and the city at the moment is really waiting for the OBR to actually pontificate on this, because really you don't have an easy choice ahead of you. Tax is already very high. And even though European tax rates are higher than in the UK, many of the countries that are growing much stronger in other parts of the world have much lower tax rates. So there's a debate about whether tax really can be forced higher and whether the UK should be resetting itself as a benchmark against low tax economies. But tax is a big debatable political issue. Public spending already very high, but austerity is not desirable. But defence spending has to increase, or likely to have to increase. So then it comes down to borrowing. And the city is already seeing probably close to around £300 billion of gilt sales this fiscal year, which is a high number. And Britain, like France, are the two G7 countries that are more dependent on foreign buying of their government debt than anyone else. So what the OBR says on this, not just about the 50-year projection, but what it actually says about the near-term outlook is really key, because it forces the political choices there to the fore. And the markets are already starting to reflect these concerns. So the OBR clearly has a margin of error in its forecasts, but that makes it very difficult when you're trying to present policy options to the Chancellor or indeed anyone else.
Just another illustration of the power of this institution of 50 people with 3 people on the Budget Responsibility Committee, yes, who are driving economic and political decisions across the piece. And Andy, one of the things that has been asked of the OBR, something that Gerard's talked about a bit, is this question of how it thinks about the impact of changing government policy. This is what people generally mean by dynamic scoring. If the government does this to the tax system or increases spending in this area in a way that they want to increase economic growth, how does the OBR take account of that potential change? And there have been some criticisms of the OBR that they're not willing enough to believe that things that government might do, which might be investing in infrastructure, it might be cutting rates of tax, it might be on childcare or any of these things, not willing enough to believe that this will make a change to their projections of growth. I mean, I can understand why they don't, because it's really hard to do. But what's your how do you approach? How did you approach that, and to what extent do you think the OBR is changing its approach to that?
In everything the OBR does, and you mentioned the leadership of the OBR. One of the simpler things about the OBR is that it has a very clear mission, if you like. There's 3 terms in the legislation of objective, impartial, and transparent, and that, in my experience when I was chief of staffing, made the job of running the OBR quite easy. You've got a small team of motivated people, and you tell them their job is to find the right answer and explain it as clearly as possible in the public documents. So that's your job, and that means that as everyone's heading off to do their staff level conversations before things come to the top of the office and the committee, and indeed the Chancellor, they have a very clear view of what they're trying to achieve. So when the Treasury comes and presents, we're thinking of this tax change because it has this economy boosting qualities, the staff are going through the analysis thinking, does this stack up is it objective, is it using the evidence wisely? And when we go and present it to the committee, are we going to say, look, they've done a bang up job here, they've reviewed all the evidence, we think it's good, so here you go, over to you to decide what to do with it? Or are they going to say, look, this is clearly one-sided, they've not looked at this, and this, they have looked at this and this? That process is the same, whether it's the baseline forecast we're considering, whether it's a small policy measure that we only think about the fiscal consequences of, or whether it is a larger, more impactful one where dynamic scoring could be appropriate. Now, it's worth saying, dynamic scoring, thinking through the macroeconomic implications of a policy measure and then the fiscal implications of those macroeconomic implications, that's a big, complicated, resource-intensive process. You wouldn't want to be doing that for every time air passenger duty is frozen by take a pound off the price of. You wouldn't want to be doing dynamic scoring for those things because it's kind of irrelevant. But for the bigger measures that meet those criteria that Gerard mentioned, it goes through a process of, does the evidence say that this will have a macroeconomic effect that's large enough for us to look at separately? Now, in your final question about whether the OBR is changing the way it's doing this is definitely yes. It's lowered the bar and it's added a great deal more transparency about how it's doing the process. In my years in the OBR, we did essentially dynamic scoring for migration policy, where it's very clear that changes the number of people in the economy and so has a macroeconomic effect. We did it for the national living wage when that was raised very significantly as a proportion of median earnings, where we did it twice, actually. Once where it was all our own work, and then once when living wage was going to be raised significantly further, where probably the best example of how a dynamic scoring approach should work. The Treasury commissioned one of the world's experts in minimum wage analysis to review all of the literature and update his own work and come to us with, look, this is the appropriate parameter you need for the core parameter for analyzing these. And this is the uncertainty around it. And so we used... essentially, we updated our analysis to say that minimum wages have a smaller negative impact at the macro level for the benefit they do for those who receive them. And we did it for childcare policy. Mm-hmm. And the childcare policy under Jeremy Hunt was probably the start of changing the way dynamic scoring is done and having more types of policy measures where we considered it.
It's good to hear you say that, because the image you're giving is the one that has landed, which is that the OBR is responsive. Because a couple of years ago, the fear was that the OBR was not dynamically scoring properly incremental changes. So you could have lots of incremental policy changes, but they would be overlooked for a big policy change. And also novel or new policy changes, because there's no evidence base, would also be overlooked. But what's coming out, and I think it's been borne out in the last 2 years, is that the OBR has been responsive to what outsiders, whether in the city or elsewhere, have been saying. And that comes to the fore, I think.
So some of the really big choices here are about the impact of total spending. So I think back in the early 2010s, one of the criticisms of the OBR, I think, was that some people felt that they weren't showing that austerity, as it was called, was having an adequately negative effect on output, and a sense that even when it comes to investment spending over a sort of over the 5-year forecast period, often the OBR tends to say, well, if you increase investment spending this year, that will increase growth a bit now, but that will tail off to zero by the 5th year. And there are certainly economists out there who felt that was unduly conservative.
Yes, and I think they had a reasonable case. I mean, the OBR was kind of institutionally skeptical of supply side policy being able to raise growth materially within 5 years. And it has switched now to take a more active view and to score macroeconomic effects of more types of policy measure. In isolation, each of those decisions is clearly correct. You should think through all the implications of big policy changes. But also the value of kind of toing and froing with the OBR to get the evidence base right actually is valuable. The thing I remembered with the childcare policy was there were kind of 2 tracks to the evidence base. One was, have we found the right study on what providing free childcare does to people's labour supply response, a very kind of economic argument, which was led by the economic side of the committee. But I was doing my old fiscal job, which is how you're going to deliver it. And, childcare in the UK, many of its problems are to do with funding, to do with recruitment of staff. And if the childcare policy is going to have the effect that you can find in an economic study, it needs to actually deliver childcare to people. And so, I was pressing on that side. And that was a useful conversation to be having because it meant that the policy was designed to meet both of those things.
One of the things that we're missing, and this is an opportunity for the future, is to have the OBR more involved in scenario planning. They do it for their 50-year ahead projection. But I remember at the end of 2011, 2012, I was very critical of the austerity then because I thought we as a country should be locking into incredibly low, longer-term borrowing rates to invest for the future. And we had that opportunity again around 2019 or so. Both 2012, 2019, interest rates went close to zero. So we should have actually been thinking that external environment has changed. And so I think there's an opportunity to use the skill set, and maybe you need more resources, to actually start to do more scenario planning, whether linked to the supply side or other measures.
I mean, one of the issues, I guess, is the OBR is constrained by the fact that it's essentially the big role is the government meeting their fiscal rule. And the fiscal rules are only ever 3 or 5 years ahead. Yeah. And most big economic policies which are really going to affect growth are going to have an effect in the long run. And it's interesting, the OBR recently put out something saying, well, if you increase investment in infrastructure, we do think it'll have a long-run effect on the size of the economy, but not necessarily going to have an effect over the period of the forecast. And that's that is something that it's tied into by the way that the fiscal rules are inevitably. I mean, a lot of people complain that they're 5 years ahead, and you can see why, because they're gameable being 5 years ahead. But actually what matters is the sustainability of policy over a long period of time. And I guess it's integrating that long-term view with the short-term issues, which is really hard, both for the OBR and more generally.
Whilst I'm very positive about the OBR, I'm very critical about these fiscal rules. We've had 10 iterations now. I think we've had 28 rules in total. And normally the lesson is that the first sign of trouble, they're discarded. The Chancellor introduced a few new rules last autumn, but already now they're starting to tie her hands. Now, obviously, when you have when you have a budget deficit and the current account deficit, and you need to keep international as well as domestic investors on side, there's an argument to have a rule. But maybe it should just be one about longer-term solvency, debt to GDP. When you start to have lots of other variations on the rule, and then they don't survive the test of time, I think that undermines the credibility of the rules themselves, particularly as the rules also then start to tie policy hands. So the markets or the city is very wary of the UK. I think of international economies, the UK has changed its fiscal rules more than anyone else. And that's a difficult situation to be in.
Andy, I wonder if you'd like to reflect on whether the role of the OBR could change in the future. I mean, one thing we've discussed is it's gained a lot of credibility. It's being well led. Its forecasts aren't too bad. But nevertheless, because of all these changes in fiscal rules and the difficult economic position we've been in, our fiscal position is not a terribly happy one. And one of the things facing the Chancellor at the moment is because she's got a very precise rule that that she needs to have current budget balance in 5 years' time, and she's only just meeting that. The very specific decisions and judgments make a big difference, one side of the line or the other. Could we move to a sort of slightly different situation where the OBR isn't saying, this is exactly where we'll be in 5 years' time, but it is almost on a traffic light? It's quite, what we think is our fiscal situation is green or amber or red or broad sense of whether the government's going in the right direction, or is that just too fluffy? And also, you've got that, the difference between amber and red is going to be a huge judgment in itself. So maybe I'm talking nonsense.
I have thought about it a lot over the years, and I just don't think it's the way the world works. The OBR puts an enormous amount of effort into scenarios, into sensitivity analysis, into generating fan charts with ever more clever methodologies underneath them. And frankly, no one cares. All that is read is headroom is £9.9 billion. And, the OBR can talk until it's blue in the face about the uncertainty around this. And, there's the different leaders of the OBR have done this in different ways. But ultimately, what people care about is the number. I used to think that the OBR could only do its job because it wasn't qualitative, it wasn't normative. And we knew full well that if we put a box in the document that said the implications of this could be the following, that the next morning, the, director of the IFS would stand up and make a normative point, a qualitative point, informed by something that, that you couldn't extract in the pre-OBR days from a budget document, but you can from the EFO because of the transparency.
For us, the fantastic thing about the OBR is things are much more transparent than they were in the past. I'm stepping down from this job, as people may know, in the next few months. But when I was interviewed for this job back in 2010, the interview panel was just as the OBR was formed. The interview panel was asking me, "Is the IFS going to have a role now that we've got an OBR?" To which my response was back then, and it's even more true now. Actually, it makes our role much easier because there's so much more information in the public domain for us to make use of in that sense.
The biggest problem with the whole OBR Treasury fiscal setup is not fiscal rules. I think the idea that fiscal policy should be run on anything other than having debt falling a bit in normal times is, that's a mistake, and people would, be gently punished for it or more. What matters is headroom. The fact that in a £3 trillion economy with near £1.5 trillion of public spending by the end, you've got £10 billion of headroom. It means that, that OBR, they only have to, breathe heavily on the productivity forecast, and the headroom can be wiped out. And that's the problem. That's why it can disappear and reappear and disappear as markets move.
Well, the numbers themselves just tell us that Britain is heading for a debt trap. And basically parliamentarians...
Define a debt trap for us.
A debt trap is when your level of debt exceeds 100% of GDP, so it's bigger than the size of your economy, and your rate of growth is less than the rate of interest you're paying on your debt. And then you have to start running a primary surplus.
Well, we have to do that at the moment now,
and
for the first time in a long time.
But when you actually think back, since probably the mid-60s, we've only had 7 years when this country has run a budget surplus. And the level of debt has kept on rising. The positive news is that debt to GDP levels, as we touched on earlier, have been higher in the past and have come down. But when one looks ahead, given that growth is low, interest rates are likely to have to settle at a higher level than pre-pandemic. That suggests that that relationship between growth and interest rates will not be favourable for the UK. And given that the level of debt is already very high, it means that tough choices have to be made. Ideally, we want it to be economic growth and reform of public sector so productivity picks up. We need to have public sector productivity improving. We need to have higher private investment. The Chancellor's positive of the last year's budget that was often overlooked was the incentive to boost investment. But as you touched on, Paul, the benefits of that take time to come through. So the real message that comes out loud and clear from the numbers themselves at the moment from the OBR is that we have a big fiscal problem, not just now, but facing us even more so in the future, which is why that 2-year, 50-year ahead projection, I think, is so relevant.
Couldn't agree more with with all of those statements. And whatever the OBR does, it's not in its power to sort any of that out. I think what is great about the OBR is we've got an institution there which is giving us, without fear or favour, the actual numbers that allow us to make those judgments, and which ought to be forcing politicians into taking those judgments seriously. We certainly didn't see any sign of that in the run-up to the last election, when everyone was very keen to completely ignore all of the things that the OBR and indeed the IFS had said. But the government now in office has no choice but to take some of this seriously, at least in the short run. So whatever the OBR does, it's certainly helped us in terms of our transparency. It's helped us to understand the problems that we're facing, and it ought to be helping governments to face up to some of those real issues. But of course, they're not easy to face up to. Reform, taxes, spending, these are hard choices. We've touched on so many issues in this episode, and many of them we could have further episodes on, not least the long-term fiscal situation. But I think we probably have run over time, as we always do, because these are such interesting conversations. So thank you very much to Andy King, currently a specialist partner at Flint Global, and to Gerard, Lyons, strategist at Netwealth, and podcast presenter himself with Elphonomics. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work here at the IFS, do visit www.ifs.org.uk and do consider further supporting us by becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We'll see you next time.